Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you joining us. I'm going to minimize this screen. Good afternoon to everyone joining us. We really appreciate your time. We are going to be getting started with our webinar, Bail Reform and Public Safety, What We Know and How Do We Move Forward. Throughout today's discussion, what we're hoping to cover, what we're going to be covering is the recent research on this question of bail reform's impact on public safety, considering its potential impact on recidivism and rearrest within the bail reform context, and even broader within the pre-trial period of a criminal case. So for this discussion, we will hear from our colleague, Renee Ropak, a senior research associate at DCJ, covering a recent report we released asking the question, does New York City's bail reform law impact recidivism, specifically discussing New York City. We then have esteemed panelists who we at the Data Collaborative for Justice are very honored are joining us to further discuss the findings in Renee's research and other findings on these issues of bail reform and public safety generally. We are honored to be joined by Ames Gruert from the Brennan Center for Justice and their Justice Program, Deanna Logan, Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice here in New York City, and Alana Sivan, the New York State Director of Criminal Justice Reform for Forward US. Again, we feel honored to have them sharing their thoughts with us. I should say my name is Crystal Rodriguez. I'm the Policy Director at the Data Collaborative for Justice. And before we turn to the presentation that we have today, as well as the panel discussion, I'd like to offer a brief primer on the most recent changes to the bail statute, just to talk about where we started and what happened in recent weeks. So we know that initially, one moment, let me just share. Okay. We know that looking back to what happened in 2019, the primary goal of the statute or the changes to the bail reform statute was to limit the use of cash bail and pretrial detention. And the statute did this in a very overview. I just want to touch base on a few things the statute did was that it established a presumption of release and established a standard for least restrictive conditions, meaning that the default assumption was that courts would release individuals unless they demonstrated a risk of flight. And subsequently, even where a risk of flight may be present, the court was encouraged to issue or to order the condition that was the least restrictive, right? Something that didn't necessarily revert to bail or jail, but something that would be appropriate to sort of match the risk that the person posed of not fleeing for risk of flight. I'm sorry. It also limited the offenses on which cash bail could be set. And thereby pretrial detention can be used, mostly to violent felony offenses. Now, it also required the courts, in the context of cases where bail was still permissible, to consider financial hardship to the individual before the court. And that was done in a few different ways. It required the court to use more accessible forms of bail, like a partially secured bond or even an unsecured bond. It also required the court to consider what the person can afford without causing an undue financial hardship. It also established non-monetary conditions. So prior to the changes in 2019, our statute was very limited in that the only choices included in the statute were either release on recognizance, meaning no conditions, an individual just promises to return to court and that's it. And then the other condition was setting money bail, setting cash bail as a monetary incentive for individuals to meet before they could secure their release. With the introduction of non-monetary conditions, the judges and courts now have a range of options, including things like pretrial supervision, which became an option across the board for all cases, requiring that every county within the state have some sort of operational program to enable them to provide pretrial supervision. Now, we know there were several changes after that initial law. We've now seen a third round of amendments just this May. And what these recent amendments did, again, broadly, was that it replaced this least restrictive condition language with language that existed before the 2019 statute was passed. And that language is about the kind and degree of control or restriction necessary to ensure that the individual return to court. Those are the words that replace the least restrictive condition language, may be synonymous with the language that already existed in the statute. Another thing that happened in these recent changes was that they limited the presumption of release to those offenses that are bail ineligible. So largely misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies, the presumption still applies, but where it applied generally to all cases, that's no longer a part of the statute. Another change that was made is that there was an added pretrial condition of combining cash bail with a non-monetary condition. In effect, that means that the judge may order someone to post a bail amount in order to secure their release, be held until they're able to post that bail amount. And then there will be non-monetary conditions imposed upon their release. So for example, pay a $10,000 bond, but if that bond is paid, the judge can also order that the individual participate in a pretrial supervision, for example. Another change to the statute in these recent weeks was that the mandatory programming mandate that had already been a pretrial option available to the courts is now specifically is described, or there's specific options in terms of to order mental health treatment or chemical dependence treatment. So judges, I think that was an option that was on the table, but however, it was not explicitly stated in the statute prior to these recent amendments. In addition, there were monthly data reporting requirements that were added to the requirements that both the Office of Court Administration and the Division of Criminal Justice Services has to meet, including information about pretrial jail commitments, the demographics of the individuals that are being held during the pretrial period, the charges they're facing, and the number of days in pretrial detention. And this would enable researchers and others to take a look and really assess how much time individuals are spending in pretrial detention prior to any conviction, prior to any resolution of their case. So with that brief primer, I would encourage all of you to look on our website where we have a much more detailed analysis of the most recent changes. And I'd like to pass it on to my colleague, Renee Ropak, who is a senior research associate here at the Data Collaborative for Justice at John Jay College. And I'm welcoming him to share his screen and begin his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me well and see my screen as well?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Just making sure. All right. Thanks so much, Crystal. I'm going to introduce myself anyways real quick. My name is Renee Ropak. I'm a senior research associate at DCJ, and I'll be presenting our recent study on the question whether New York's bail reform affected recidivism in New York City. And to do that, we conducted a quasi-experimental test. So just a refresher, Crystal mentioned it already, but a refresher about New York's bail reform. So the original bail reform took effect on January 1, 2020. There's two key components that we tested in our study. One was the ban of cash bail and pretrial detention for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. And two, we also looked at the impact of the reduced use of bail for cases that remained eligible for it, which applies to virtually all violent felonies. And especially the second part was brought about primarily by the universal availability of pretrial supervision. So pre-reform, for example, it was not available to people charged with violent felony offenses. On top of that, judges had to use the had to release individuals on their own recognizance unless there's a demonstrable risk of flight. And even if there is a flight risk, judges had to use the least restrictive release condition necessary to ensure court appearance. Another aspect we looked in our study were the 2020 bail amendments. They took effect only 6 months after original bail reform was implemented on July 2nd, 2020. And here the key changes were basically that lawmakers returned discretion to judges to bail or detain people for certain charges or under certain circumstances that were originally made bail ineligible only 6 months prior. Before I go into our study, I want to just summarize the results of another study that also was published recently on the question of whether New York's bail reform affected public safety. Specifically, they looked at crime rates. So the research question they posed was, did bail reform lead to a loss of general deterrence and thereby increasing index crime rates in New York State? And that study was conducted by 2 researchers at the University of Albany. The methods that they used was they basically compared the change in index crime rates pre versus post-reform in New York State and compared that to the changes in index crime rates in other states. And their findings were that certain index crime rates increased in New York State following bail reform, but they also increased at similar rates in other states. And therefore, the conclusion is that the crime increases in New York State cannot be attributed to bail reform. When it comes to the recidivism impact of bail reform, however, there's 2 competing theories. One theory is that release under reform would increase recidivism, which is a necessary implication of not incapacitating people in jail. The other theory is that release under reform reduces recidivism as it avoids the criminogenic effects of detention once people are released. Obviously, those 2 theories are not mutually exclusive. So the real question is, which one of the 2 mechanisms outweighs the other, and what is the net effect of bail reform on recidivism? So in our study, we formulated a total of 4 research questions. I'll present only on the first 3 today, just to keep time in mind. All questions pertain to the overarching question whether reform affected public safety. So first, we looked at whether what the recidivism impact was of banning cash bail and detention for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. Second, we looked at the recidivism impact of the reforms that reduced the use of bail for eligible cases. Third, we looked at whether the recidivism impacts varied by charge or criminal history characteristics. And the 4th research question that I won't address today, but that is addressed in our report, is what the impact was of the 2020 amendments that made certain cases bail eligible once again. So for the current study, we use data from the New York State Office of Court Administration, OCA. We have a non-public data set for which we have all cases that originated in criminal court between 2017 and June 2022. And we looked at all prosecuted arrests for misdemeanors or felonies in New York City. And we looked at people who were arraigned in the first half of 2019, pre-reform, and people who were arraigned in the first half of 2020, post-reform. The criminal history variables that we use to control go 2 years into the past. As I said, we have data starting in 2017. So the first case in our analytic sample was arraigned on January 1, 2019. So we have exactly 2 years for such a case. And then for our recidivism measures, we followed everybody through June 30th, 2022, which also gives us a minimum of a 2-year follow-up period for everybody. Our analytic approach was to not look at just pretrial rearrest. Instead, we wanted to look at the longer term. So we looked at a minimum of a 2-year follow-up period, and for some people for up to 30 months. And the idea here was that if we only look at pretrial rearrest, we put a lot of weight onto the incapacitation effect of detention, and we pay very little attention to the criminogenic effects of pretrial detention. Therefore, looking at a longer follow-up period than just the pretrial period is crucial to get at the overall impact of bail reform on public safety. Also in New York City, a large swath of cases that were made bail ineligible by bail reform were already routinely released by New York City judges even before reform took effect. And therefore, we wanted to do a relevant comparison. So we only wanted to look at cases that were practically impacted by reform and not just theoretically. And to do so, we looked at people who had bail set or were remanded in the first half of 2019, and we compared their recidivism rates to statistically similar people who were released in the first half of 2020 under reform. And when I say statistically similar people, by that I mean that we created matched samples. So we have our pre-reform samples and our post-reform samples are almost identical in terms of criminal history characteristics, charge characteristics, demographics, the month in which the case was arraigned, and so forth. And we look at 4 different outcome variables. We look at overall rearrest, so any rearrest for a misdemeanor or a felony. We look at felony rearrest, violent felony rearrest, and firearm rearrest. And then finally, we conducted 2 types of analyses. One, we looked at the likelihood of rearrest within 2 years and compared those likelihoods between the 2 groups. And then we used survival analyses to also look at how quickly people were rearrested, if at all. And here we used a tracking period of up to 30 months. So let's get to the first research question. What was the recidivism impact of eliminating bail and detention? So here we use the pre versus post design. So again, we looked at people in the comparison group who were bailed or remanded pre-reform in the first half of 2019, and we compared their recidivism rates to statistically similar people who were mandatorily released in the first half of 2020. Obviously, people in the bail reform group were on average detained for much longer than people in the bail reform group. So in the comparison group, the average person was arraigned for 61 days, and the average length of detention in the bail reform group was only 3 days. So here's the results for our 2-year rearrest rates. And here we show the 2-year rearrest estimates by group. So those are not raw recidivism rates. Those are estimates based on the statistical model I just described. And we see here that people in the bail reform group were significantly less likely to be rearrested for any offense or for a felony offense within 2 years of their arraignment, compared to statistically similar people who were bailed or detained pre-reform in the comparison group. We did not find any differences for violent felony rearrest or firearm rearrest, however. Then when we look at the results from our survival analysis, they paint a very similar picture. And let me walk everybody through what these graphs here show. So on the left-hand side, we see the graph for overall rearrest, so whether anyone was rearrested for either a misdemeanor or a felony. On the right-hand side, we see the graph for felony rearrest. And the x-axis here at the bottom shows the number of days that had passed since everybody's arraignment. So day 0 on the very left bottom here is the day of everybody's arraignment. And on day 0, 100% of people in the comparison group and the bail reform group have survived. In other words, had not been rearrested yet. And as time goes by, in other words, as we move to the right on our graphs, we see that these curves go down, which means more and more people were rearrested over time. And it's very obvious from these graphs that people in the comparison group, the curves for the comparison group are steeper than the curves for the bail reform group, signifying that people in the comparison group were rearrested more quickly for any offense or for a felony offense than people in the bail reform group. And that gap goes wider as time goes by, suggesting that the benefits of release without bail increase over time. I don't show the graphs here for felony and firearm rearrest. However, we also found a statistically significant result for violent felony rearrest, showing the same pattern that people in the comparison group were more quickly rearrested for a VFO than people in the bail reform group. So overall, we found for the 2-year recidivism rates, we found that release without bail reduced overall and felony recidivism. When we looked at our survival analysis models, where we looked at up to 30 months tracking period instead of just 2 years, we found that release without bail also delayed overall in felony recidivism. And on top of that, we also found a delay in violent felony recidivism. So in short, the upshot is that eliminating bail and detention reduced rearrest rates. Let's get to our second research question. What was the recidivism impact of the reduced use of bail in legally eligible cases? Here we used two types of designs. We used both a pre and post design, just as we did for the previous question. And then on top of that, we looked at it from a slightly different angle by also using a contemporaneous design. So in the pre-post design, we again compare people who were bailed or remanded pre-reform to statistically similar people who were released post-reform. In the contemporaneous design, however, we compared people who were all arraigned in the first half of 2020. So here the comparison group are people who were bailed or remanded in between January and June 2020, and we compared their recidivism rates to statistically similar people who were released post-reform. And here we could do that because obviously bail and detention was still on the table for those cases, whereas that was not the case for the mandatory release cases, as it was literally banned. So here's the results, the 2-year rearrest estimates for each group based on the pre versus post analysis. And here we see that people in the bail reform group had significantly higher recidivism rates across the board. That is for all 4 outcomes. And those results are statistically significant. However, the effect sizes are relatively small. They do not exceed 2.5 percentage points. Moreover, when we look at the results from our survival analysis based on the pre-post analysis, we actually do not find any significant differences in how quickly people were rearrested for any offense, for a felony offense, or for a violent felony offense. And so, for example, on the left-hand side here, those two curves for the comparison and the bail reform group are almost exactly overlapping. So we really don't see differences here in how quickly people were rearrested. However, we did find that people in the bail reform group were slightly more quickly rearrested for a firearm offense. So that's the only result that's consistent with what we found when we looked at the 2-year recidivism estimates. However, when we look at the results from the contemporaneous analysis, on the other hand, the results show go into the other direction. So here we did not find any differences for overall rearrest or for firearm rearrest between the two groups, but we did find that people in the bail reform group were less likely to be rearrested for a felony offense or for a violent felony offense than statistically similar people in the comparison group. In other words, so it again here, those results are statistically significant, but the effect sizes again are relatively small. And once we look at the longer time tracking period of up to 30 months, however, in the survival analysis, we did not find any statistically significant differences for any of the 4 outcome variables. So in other words, those small effect sizes that we found in the over 2-year recidivism, they went away once we looked at a longer tracking period of up to 2.5 years. So what does that mean in conjunction? So for the pre versus post analysis, we found that there was a slight increase in recidivism, in 2-year recidivism for any offense, felony offense, violent felony offense, and firearm offense. However, the survival analysis only found that people who were released were slightly more quickly rearrested for a firearm offense. In the contemporaneous analysis, on the other hand, we found that release led to a slight recidivism decrease for felony and violent felony offenses, and we did not find any effects based on our survival analysis in the contemporaneous design. So in short, we have inconsistent findings across the 2 designs. However, all results are either not statistically significant or small in their effect size, and therefore the upshot is that releasing more bail eligible people did not affect recidivism in either direction. And then finally, did the recidivism impacts vary by charge or criminal history characteristics? So in other words, are there certain subgroups where bail reform worked better than for others? So what we did here, when we broke our samples down by charge severity. So for the mandatory release sample, we looked at people who were charged with misdemeanors and people who were charged with felonies. In the bail eligible sample, we looked at people who were charged with either a misdemeanor or a non-violent felony, or NVF on this slide. And then we also looked at people who were charged with a violent felony for the current arrest. And then we broke down the criminal history characteristics in 3 different ways for both samples. So we looked at people who had a recent prior arrest, and by recent prior arrest mean up to 2 years before the current arraignment, as that's how far back our criminal history variables go. So we looked at people who had a prior arrest or who did not have a recent prior arrest. We looked at people who had a prior VFO and people who did not have a prior violent felony arrest. And finally, we looked at people who had a pending case at the time of their arraignment and people who did not. And here's the results for the subgroup, for those different subgroups. I'm only showing the statistically significant results. So let's start with the mandatory release sample at the top. We found that release reduced overall felony and violent felony recidivism for people who were charged with misdemeanors, for people who did not have any recent arrests, for people who did not have any recent violent felony offense arrests or cases, and for people who did not have any pending cases. However, on the other hand, we found that release increased overall felony and violent felony recidivism for people who had a recent VFO and people who had a pending case at their arraignment, at the time of their arraignment. And here I should just point out, when we look at the columns that say percentage of the total sample, that only a small subset of all people included in our study had a recent VFO. That's only 9% of everybody, and only 15% of all cases included in the analysis had a pending case. So in other words, the subgroups where release increased recidivism were a small minority of all cases practically affected by the policy. Then let's move on to the bail eligible cases here at the bottom. Again, overall, we did not find an effect in either direction. However, we did find effects for specific subgroups. So we found that in the bail eligible population, release reduced recidivism, that is overall recidivism, for people who did not have any recent arrests. However, it increased overall recidivism for people who had a recent violent felony arrest. And again, people with recent VFOs, even in that population, even in the bail eligible population, which is primarily people charged with violent felony offenses, only 11% of these people had a recent VFO on their rap sheet. So overall, we found for our different subgroup analyses that release without bail tended to reduce recidivism for people facing less serious charges and for people with limited or no recent criminal history. On the other hand, we found that release increased recidivism for people with more substantial criminal histories, such as having pending cases or especially having a recent prior VFO. So just to summarize all our findings, first, we found that the elimination of bail and detention reduced recidivism overall. Second, we found that the reduced use of bail for bail eligible cases did not affect recidivism in either direction. However, our subgroup analysis showed that bail reform tended to reduce recidivism for people facing less serious charges and with limited or no recent criminal history, and increased recidivism for people with more substantial criminal histories. Thank you very much, and I'm going to open it up to the panel now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renee. I really appreciate that your presentation. I want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, even about what Renee just covered, you can enter your questions into the Q&A box. He won't be taking questions immediately, but later in the program, we will have a Q&A session for everyone in the audience, and Renee will be included so he can respond to any questions you might have. At this time, I'd like to welcome and thank the panelists who are joining me. I gave brief introductions to who they are, so I think we can dig right into the conversation. And I would like to start with Ames of the Brennan Center. Ames, hearing the work that Renee did and hearing the findings from the presentation, I would like to turn to you, given some of the recent research and literature review that you all are conducting around this specific issue of bail reform's impact, any relation or non-relation to public safety. Of what you've learned so far, reviewing that evidence, what have your findings been? How are they similar? How are they different from what Renee learned in his study?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and a big thank you to you and the team for inviting me to be part of this incredible panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone here and learning from what you all have to say about this very complicated field. So I'm actually going to take a moment to flatter our sponsors and Renee in passing by noting that there hasn't really been a ton of truly causal research on the impacts of bail reform on recidivism before now. And what I mean by that is recidivism that allows you to say this specific public safety metric has changed after a policy change in bail. And moreover, we can say that that change happened because of a change in bail policy. There's not been a ton of research on that. In fact, I'm not really aware of any off the top of my head. Could be wrong. Instead, most of the studies that have been done before now are along the lines of before and after comparisons. So they'll look at a key public safety metric like rearrest rates, failure to appear rates, before the implementation of a bail reform policy, and then the same metric after. That can be really illuminating. DCJ has done important work along those lines before the study, and I continue to reference it in my own research. But a real problem with that is it doesn't allow you to control for other potential things that might that might explain change in public safety metrics. For example, as you all know, bail reform went into effect in 2020, pretty close to contemporaneously with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the enactment of discovery reform, as well as the beginning of a truly nationwide increase in violent crime, which I know we'll talk about later. So, the real value of this study and the research being presented here today, and if I were a policymaker, why I'd be keeping a real tight eye on the study, is it really does attempt this sort of causal analysis. So 3 cheers for the team. So now, knowing that with that limitation, what do we see from other research in the field? I think we actually do see some sort of similar findings. So several analyses have been done on the effects of misdemeanor bail reform in Houston, Texas. That's where a federal judge essentially eliminated bail in most misdemeanor cases. Some of those studies have come to different conclusions, creating a sort of dueling studies problem. The best and most recent, I think, is out of the Quattrone Center last year. And critically, it found no impact of misdemeanor bail reform on any key recidivism metrics. That's not to say it didn't find any change in criminal justice outcomes. It found that guilty pleas dropped by a fairly sharp degree, around 15%, as well as conviction rates. Those are aligned with the goals of bail reform. One of the reasons we pursue something like bail reform is we want to reduce convictions that are induced by incarceration rather than by evidence of guilt. So I think that's a really interesting study and sort of sheds some very similar light on the impact of bail policies. Another one that we've kept an eye on, especially because it's also been in the public eye, is a study of a court order out of Cook County, Illinois, that adopted a number of fairly significant reforms to bail policies in Cook County, which of course covers Chicago. One of them, it required release on the least restrictive conditions available, language that should be familiar to everyone who followed the bail debate this year. That also found a very slight increase in failure to appear, but no increases in recidivism. There are some other analyses, and this, I think, gets to some of the nuance that Renee uncovers in this paper. There are some other analyses out there that find relatively small increases in recidivism after bail reforms, but those sorts of papers then go on to question, I think quite correctly, how to evaluate those increases along with the benefits of bail reform, such as reducing the criminogenic effect of jail, reducing job loss, reducing other collateral consequences that we know flow from incarceration. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind as well. I'm just going to note just a couple more things, and then I'll turn it back. Another paper that I think really fits really neatly with the findings we've seen today, and that I think folks should have an eye on, is an analysis out of the New York City Criminal Justice Agency. This is a group that contracts with the city government, which we'll probably hear more about soon. They provide pretrial services, among other extremely valuable things for the city. They replicate one key finding of Renee's. They find that rearrest rates are low for the vast majority of defendants post-bail reform, but they were relatively high and appeared to have increased in a small percentage of cases where people had prior open cases, prior convictions. Depending on how you cut their data, that high risk population as in the like 4 to 18% range, like it's overwhelmingly the minority of cases. That fits really neatly with what we found here, which shows that on net, bail reform has increased recidivism, but also points to a really vital need to like zoom in and not just take the 500-foot view, but zoom in and see what's happening in specific types of cases. So just to wrap up, and thank you so much for the time to walk through all of that. If you're reviewing the evidence before this paper, I think you had concluded that bail reform likely had no effect on rearrests. And I think that finding largely holds. The more nuanced findings that we're able to pull out here are a direct result of this more careful quasi-experimental design that the team has used here. And I think it's a real benefit to those of us who study this issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Ames. I'd like to turn over to Deanna, the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. In part of your role in looking at this question is obviously considering what to do in your role as government, right? How to better address the needs of the population, people's concerns around public safety generally, right? Both folks who are coming through the justice system and even just more broadly than even the folks that are solely the folks who are justice involved. And I know that you all have done some work specifically on looking at this question, looking at the pretrial population and trying to hone in on this question of recidivism, or rearrest or failures to appear, which is another essential purpose of the bail statute. And of course, court appearances remain a priority. I'm wondering, could you share with us, what have you identified as being likely among the folks who are most likely to reoccur, have reoccurring contacts with the criminal justice system, and whether or not, if you can speak to any of the symmetry that exists between, what Renee shared about the folks who may present with particular characteristics, as well as some of what Ames shared as well. If you can give us an idea of what you've uncovered and also what percentage or what group of that population that represents.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for having us. I'm very honored to be here with all of the panelists and you. We're really kind of excited right now at the time that we find ourselves, right? Just because we're in a place where a lot of the stakeholders in the criminal justice system are really seeing the same thing. It's just kind of what perspective we're coming at the data, right? And I need to start by thanking all of the, Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, but we're affectionately referred to as MOCJ, so I'll refer to us as MOCJ too. MOCJ partners that we contract with, because they're kind of the ones that raised the hand and started us looking very, very granularly at what was going on. So specifically, our partners that we contract with started talking to us about the fact that there was a very unique group that they were seeing and that they were working with that they were struggling to actually support. And our research team really started to dig in on this because they love a challenge and we all love a challenge. And they said, let's look at the data. What is the data showing us? What does this group look like? What are the characteristics? And what, if anything, do we need to do? Of course, that means sometimes we go down rabbit holes, but then sometimes it means that we actually better the services that we as government provide to the New Yorkers that they're entitled to, right? And in this instance, it was the latter. because what we started seeing, and I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see my screen? No, not yet. Okay, let's see, computer work. How about now? Yay. Okay, so what we started seeing was a population of people that when we looked at 2022, we said, okay, how many people, how many arrests happened in 2022? And what we saw was out of 190,000 citywide arrests in 2022, there were approximately a band of 9,000 people. And when we say 9,000 people, we're not talking about a list, because I think people start to think, oh, there's a list that we can tick off the names, you know, Deanna Logan's #1 and Crystal's #2. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a consistent trend of approximately 9,000 people that were coming into New York City courts again and again, and that were having recurring criminal charges. And the things that those individuals had in common was that they had felony arrests, and then they had already a pending felony arrest. They had multiple, what we say recent warrants, meaning anywhere between 2 and 5 years, and they already had a pending felony. And the one thing that all of our team really highlights for me is that the recency really is the key, right? That whole acute pattern of coming back into the criminal justice system. So we think of it as a recurring criminal charges pattern, and we look at the percentage that those individuals make up of the overall landscape. And honestly, what all of the partners are saying, what Ames has pointed to, what Renee has pointed to, is it's a very small population of people. We're talking about 8%. And within that 8%, there's a consistent 2,000 that we're seeing are getting rearrested for a new violent felony offense, right? And what our partners very clearly said to us was that this small population was really struggling to modify their behavior, and partners were really trying to think about how we support them, because when we drilled in even deeper, we realized that they disproportionately make up a huge percentage in overall felony arrests. You're talking about 27%. Citywide arrests are 22%, and the numbers can get higher, right? When we're looking at robbery cases, burglaries are 57%, they make up of those types of arrests. Grand larcenies and auto larcenies, 30, 36, 33, and in the petty larceny category, over 60% are represented there. So that small population that was not susceptible to all of the supports that our partners were providing, that had been wildly successful with the majority of the population that they were supporting in supervised release, were not actually responding to the supports. And they were having a recent pattern of recurring criminal charges. And what we know about this population is that they are struggling with their own fight or flight mechanism, right? In their nervous system response. And what that means, because it took me a little while to really wrap my brain around what that actually means for each individual human. It means that the things that most people take for granted, things that seem like everyday tasks, are things that this population that we're really trying to support, their nervous system responds to it the same way that most other individuals would respond to something that is like a heightened risk. You know, one of the examples that somebody gave me was that being attacked by a tiger, that their body and their nervous system reacts that same way. So the simple task of saying you need to be at this location at 10 o'clock on Tuesday elicited that type of nervous response for them that they were having to fight against just to make it to that appointment. As we worked with our partners, we started to look at the programs that were being used in other jurisdictions, and we're working on designing and employing strategies that include more targeted, intense form of supervision for these individuals to make sure that we're giving them individualized support that builds coping skills to overcome the behavior that they're struggling to overcome. You know, I'm looking forward to us talking more about strategies that do include some intensive case management, that adds like robust staff members that are trained in evidence-based supervision models, implementing more bridging skills, intervention skills, and motivational interviewing for some of our partners. You know, overall, our goal for good government is to be in a place where all of the people that we serve, that you know, put us where we're supposed to be, are getting the most effective services that meet their individual needs. And so as an administration, we're looking to approach criminal justice as an ecosystem, right? And that ecosystem means that all of us across the city, not just within the criminal justice landscape, have to continue investing, right? So we have to invest in youth and neighborhoods in ways that to start address the fundamental building blocks for success, right? Housing, well-paying, meaningful employment, making sure that we don't have food deserts. And we talk with our sister agencies, you know, and our DYCD, or the Department of Youth and Community Development, with Department of Education, with DHS Housing, to make sure that we as a city are strengthening that. And for us here at MACHE, you know, talking to them about the universal preventative measures that they're deploying, we also focus on how we can strengthen the array of services and supports that we provide individuals within the criminal justice system. So, you know, our partners across from supervised release to alternatives to incarceration and reentry are all focused on making sure that we are giving paid short-term employment opportunities for it, job training, career certifications, connections to permanent employment, holistic wraparound services that include a multitude, right? The whole person, mental, behavioral, physical health care. Family support is critical, and making sure that we do that across the spectrum, and we work with folks towards reunification, making sure that they have benefit assistance so that they can navigate the world and that people understand how to support them, making sure their case management folks are there for them and continue to go back and provide that rigorous support that they need, in addition to the education and housing components. We have been really drilling down on that this year. I'm really proud to say that we focused very, very heavily on housing. As many of you know, during COVID, we stood up emergency hotels to ensure that folks that were criminally justice impacted had some place to be during the public health emergency. And we have transitioned that to more permanent housing and a transitional housing scheme, where our head of transitional housing has started a huge campaign for open minds and open doors, where we're making sure that landlords and brokers know that we're looking for apartments to give people second, third, fourth, fifth chances as they're coming back from incarceration and becoming the citizens that they want to be, that they've worked really hard to be. So ultimately, what I want us to take away from what we as good government are trying to do is know that we understand that there's not one thing that's needed to strengthen the public safety landscape. Good government provides an array of services to meet people where they are, and will support and build healthy neighborhoods. And that's what we're working towards as we look at this population.
Thank you, Deanna. Thank you for sort of laying that, just explaining it so clearly in terms of like what you learned about the pretrial population, where some of the concern might be concentrated, and then thinking about what are some steps forward to better address, better assist folks who are coming through the justice system, right? Because they are residents, they're our community members, they're our neighbors, and it's important to address this problem holistically. You know, there are real concerns, at least we've heard a lot of concern around public safety issues being connected to bail reform in the media and other spaces. And I want to turn to Alana to address this question. And, you know, part of the reason why we're talking about it is because it is important, right? And everyone is invested in in community safety. Everyone's invested in community safety. We live here, we work here, we're all interested. It's all in our best interest, right, to pursue this better outcomes in this case. And I hear that there's some, so Deanna, as you started your presentation, you said that, we're kind of saying the same thing, right? There's like particular characteristics or particular things that may flag for reoccurring conflicts with the criminal justice systems. I would love to turn it over to you, Ilana, to talk about how might be, how do we think about this problem more holistically, right? Like, what are some of the benefits to community that we could see? How can we think more specifically about this issue, and some of your general takeaways, and what policy takeaways to be based on what we've learned about the pretrial population?
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So I'll first start it out by saying concerns with safety exist within the world of folks who care about criminal justice reform and who want to see reductions in the jail system. I'm somebody who thinks about public safety all of the time. It's something that my neighbors think about. And what we've seen overwhelmingly come through with the data that you just put forward, the multitude of studies that we've seen before this study that showed, bail not being a driver of rising crime, is that if we are concerned about public safety, that looking at bail reform is really a distraction to that, because it's not a driving force of crime. And so part of really considering public safety means looking to the sorts of alternatives, the sort of holistic alternatives that you were talking about that actually keep communities whole and safe. And the data that you put out is really important, and a lot of the data surrounding bail reform that we have, because of a lot of the great mechanisms that the Division of Criminal Justice Services have put out. But what we don't talk about enough is the positive data, the positive stories, all of the people who are able to come home as a result of bail reform. And we recently did that in a study that we did at forward.us, and I'll just share my screen very quickly to talk through some of the results of that study. Let's see, how do I turn this into a slideshow? Okay. So similarly to the study that Renee was talking about, although not nearly as not using all of the same data tools that you all have, but we did a comparison of folks pre and post bail reform to determine what impact bail reform had on people who are able to continue leading their lives. So as a result of bail reform, 24,000 fewer people in the first 2 years following its passage had bail set on their cases. That's $104 million less set in bail that could otherwise have been leveraged or lost by New York's poor and working class families. And that number is really important because, this is money that now families don't have to make this really difficult decision of, do I have to forego my rent money? Do I have to forego my healthcare money? Do I have to forego the after school snacks that I'm going to buy for my kids to be able to gather up the cost to be able to pay bail? And we know that those are the sorts of things that when people spend money on them, will keep them healthy, safe, whole, and have anti-criminogenic effects. So in that way, there's some suggestion that, for this group particularly, that bail reform is increasing public safety. And that's also 1.9 million nights that would have otherwise been spent in jail that are now being spent at home, and an overall reduction of 15% of the pretrial population. And again, these numbers are really important because they sort of show that bail reform is really helping a lot of folks right now. And if we consider the people who are behind bars as community members, which we absolutely should, then particularly for this group, public safety is increasing exponentially. The folks who are in Rikers, who otherwise would be in Rikers Island pre-trial without having been convicted of a crime, who, as we've seen in the past few years, being in Rikers Island is often deadly and can risk short-term harm, things like missing a day of work, which has long-term impacts, or long-term harm, resulting in, as we've seen over the past 2 years with the people who have died in Rikers Island at higher numbers than in recent history. And so given all of these benefits of bail reform, given how we've seen it's not driving rises in crime, and given all of the benefits that it's providing to people in the community, despite all of that, we've seen 3 rollbacks to the law. And every time there's a rollback to the law, there's this narrative, well, we need to change it because we need to address public safety. And so it was baffling to a lot of us at forward.us that this is a conversation that keeps happening, given sort of the plethora of data out there that says, like, hey, maybe we should be looking at other things to resolve crime levels, given that bail reform isn't really the driver. And so what we did was look at the impact of media. And so in our recent report called Freedom Then the Press, Volume 2, we look at media mentions of bail reform and crime, and looked at both. And what we had done in previous reports was look at sort of the content of those articles. So the use of dehumanizing language, the dissemination of misinformation, relying solely on law enforcement sources. And we did a little bit of that in this report, but we really focused on how many articles are being released connecting bail reform and crime, and how many of these articles are ignoring all of these studies showing that bail reform isn't leading to a rise in crime. And so you can see in these 2 graphs, sort of the summary of those numbers. And we see that there are a significant amount of mentions of bail reform and crime, and they're most significant and most voluminous right before rounds of rollbacks and right before elections. And what's also interesting to note, so in that report, we also go through, and here we have 4 studies, but since this report was published back in December, there's about 6 studies and maybe even 7 with the recent Albany report, 7 with the recent Albany report. And with this, most recent one being one of the most comprehensive. But we see how after each study, starting from a study that MockJ put out very shortly after the implementation of bail reform, that article after article after article continued to come out falsely connecting bail reform and rises in crime. And so I say all of this to say that, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I say all of this to say that the data is super important, and all of the data showing, the overall impact of bail reform and recidivism, the data showing all of the people whose lives have been changed, arguably saved as a result of bail reform. But the data about how it's reported is also important. So all of the information showing how the media is actually influencing the way that we talk about bail reform is really important to keep an eye on, and also to correct at every possible opportunity, because we know it has a real impact. And we also see that it's very possible in the future, with future reforms. We just saw that clean slate pass. There's probably going to be an avalanche of misinformation around that as well. And so to continue to come back to the data, sort of this grounding force to say, actually, no, this is what bail reform actually has done, and this is why we need to continue to fight for it to stay intact.
Thank you, Alana, for that. I'd like to turn back to Deanna for a moment. Alana raises these points about how the bail reform is sort of being the straw man for any issue that can be even remotely connected to public safety. And what your work has done has been to ask the question, I think, from a different perspective a bit, like dealing with the bail reform context that we have, dealing with what the law says now. It seems like your office focuses like, okay, but who are the people coming through the criminal justice system? How can we look at them more holistically as not just the label that's placed on them in the media, but how do we actually address the underlying causes of their initial interaction with the criminal justice system to start with? And would you be able to share some of what are the things that your office is thinking about, or some strategies you might be considering in order to better support this population going forward?
Thank you. Yeah, it is. The first slide that I had that I didn't bother to keep up very long was the fact that we are investing in people, right? Like that is grounded in looking at behavioral health for lots of the strategies on how we support people, but really thinking about where we take our, now as we're in fiscal crisis, our limited city dollars to support people best. So one of the things we did that was a quick like pilot study that we did in Queens. And in Queens, our partner was able to stand up with the Office of Court Administration, a separate part for individuals that we saw were struggling with being supported with normal supports. And what they did was start to look at, okay, we're going to make sure that individuals that start missing their court dates or are missing their appointments for services, that we bring them back together and we bring them into court with a judge that is grounded in all of the ideology and understanding that healing trauma and being able to move forward is not a linear process, right? That people are going to have moments where they struggle, and then they're going to have moments where they're successes. And so having that partner with the court administration and with our service provider, we were able to then bring people in and help them start to correct behavior. And what we saw in the short period of time ending somewhere around October of last year was a very significant decrease in warrants, because individuals that were in this higher elevated kind of response mechanism, all of their cases went to this judge. That judge was invested in their success as individuals and let them know that. The partners then were able to focus in on the individuals to make sure that they were giving the support, but also the follow-up and the encouragement that the individuals that are having that heightened response need. And we are confident that once we start being able to really do that systemically across the board, we will see a lot more successes for individuals that are struggling. And anecdotally, we're starting to see the numbers of warrants tick up now that that part is not operating. And so we're looking at that. We're looking at how we incorporate some of the behavioral health concerns for, the psychoeducation, getting individuals to really understand themselves. What is it that I feel when I have done these actions before, when I start to have the feeling? And I think what people don't understand is, I think there's a misconcept of whether the feeling is real or not real. The feeling is absolutely real for those individuals. The response that they have is one that may not be consistent with the actual what's happening. And so part of the psychoeducation is to get individuals to self-identify when they have those feelings, what the things are that make them have those feelings, and then really, really talk themselves to why that may not be consistent with the situation that they're in, and either reach out for the help that they need to overcome it, or have their own coping skills that get them to be able to say, I identify that this is what it is. Historically, I have acted in this way and it hasn't been beneficial for me. And so now I know that even though this is how I feel, I'm going to take a different step, and I'm going to do something that I know I need to get to in order to start being successful in my life and reaching the goals that I individually am setting for myself, and making sure that they have the case managers and partners that are trained and skilled to support them as they go through their cases in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Ames, I want to ask you a similar question. I think Alana, you might have something to add to this conversation as well. Is there any particular approaches that you have seen, even in jurisdictions outside of New York City, outside of New York State, that taken innovative, effective, or promising approaches in addressing public safety or supporting the pretrial population?
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I'd love to hear more from Alana on this as well. So I think one thing to really bear in mind here is an outgrowth of what Deanna just shared. There's a huge gap between what is written on the pages of a statute book and how the law is actually implemented on the ground. And if you want to change outcomes of a major policy change like bail reform, your options aren't just to change what the law says on the books. Your options are to convene stakeholders, build some of the programs that we're hearing about here, and make sure they're well funded. That, among other good outcomes, ensures that policy changes to innovate in the pretrial space don't have to solely take place in highly politically charged late night legislative sessions that can happen and more carefully thought out interventions. So I wanted to touch on one that I've heard some good things about and then that there is some research backing for. So one thing that I think is worth thinking about is supervised release programs. Other research by DCJ has shown that there was a huge increase in release on non-monetary conditions after bail reform went into effect. That means people who weren't released on their own recognizance. Bail wasn't set, nor were they detained. Instead, they were released with specific requirements as conditions of their release. That is up to and including like a forms of supervision administered by mock J partners and city partners. I've studied those programs. I studied them before bail reform went into effect. I think they're really powerful. I think they can do some really good work. I also think they are being asked to shoulder a very heavy burden. So some of the more encouraging things I've seen in the bail reform debate in Albany lately has been increase in funding for pretrial services. I think that's really encouraging. That's especially needed upstate, where just simply put, the density of nonprofit organizations in the 5 boroughs is unmatched anywhere in this country, and that includes upstate New York. So there's more money needed for those sorts of programs outside the 5 boroughs. And I'll wrap this up very quickly by noting that there is really some research indicating that supervised release programs can work. I'm thinking of, there's a study out of Orange County that found that failure to appear dropped significantly under a supervised release program out of that jurisdiction. So, broadly, I think if we get non-monetary release conditions right, if we get programs like this right, it can be a complement to address some of the issues that we've heard about today.
Thank you. Lana, would you like to?
Yeah, I can jump in.
Yeah, any particular?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I have to say that I think I'm probably preaching to the choir on here, but it's worth saying, which is we got into sort of the mess of mass incarceration in the 1990s by looking at isolated incidents or sort of small groups and deciding to create jail increasing policies for the whole based on sort of these small isolated incidents or small groups. And so I really think it's important that we remember that didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. And also that we, just reminding folks of sort of the danger of creating more carceral policies when specifically we're talking about overwhelming data that otherwise shows that reductions in incarcerations are helpful. So getting that out of the way, I think there are a whole host of alternatives that have been proven to be particularly effective when it comes to increasing public safety for the pretrial population and also for just the population at large. So housing increases in supportive housing is huge and have shown to be particularly effective even in New York. In New York City, an evaluation of the Frequent User Systems Engagement Program, or FUSE, showed that 86% of people who participate in that program spent 40% less time in jail compared to a comparison group. So we know that giving people the supports that they need while they are out is something that can prevent people from entering the criminal justice system again. And also both as a pretrial mechanism, but also as a whole public safety measure and community wellness measure, increases in mental health treatment. There was a study showed that increases, that Medicaid expansion, which increased access to behavioral health care, produced a 20 to 32% reduction in overall arrest rates for the first 2 years. things like more violence interruption programs in communities, and making it so that violence interruption programs can even start in hospitals directly following an incident of violence can be extremely effective as well. So these are the sorts of policies that we really should be looking at, instead of, at the last moment, trying to scramble around new changes to criminal justice reforms, as Ames so smartly said a little bit earlier.
Thank you for that. And I just want to, we're having such a rich conversation. I really want to get to the audience questions, because there's a rich conversation happening in the Q&A as well. And I really appreciate folks who are answering those questions, and I want to turn to them. I want to just quickly thank Alana for her last comments and say, we know that there hasn't been great research that supports jail as a public safety measure that increases or decrease the likelihood of further occurrences across the board, right? We know that that is a very limited approach. And I think the other sort of elephant in the room in this conversation is that we're talking about pretrial population. We're talking about folks who have not been convicted, have not been found guilty, have not seen trial yet. And I think those presumptions built into our legal system are super important to uphold. So I think that's what makes this a conversation about, like, what else can we do? So important and so central to thoughts on the justice system and public safety generally. I would like to begin to turn to some of the Q&A. I think, again, the audience is entering quite a bit, so I'm skimming and trying to get to something that I think would be, I mean, all the questions are great, but I want to hone in on something in particular. I think it was in connection to Renee's presentation, but I think this also applies to all of the folks here on this panel. And it's, what are the implications of this research for policy? I think getting right into the point, does this mean we should be releasing more people without money bond across the board, right? Based on what we know, if you have any response to that, I think that kind of goes to what we've been saying. But I'd like to just put it out to anyone who would like to answer.
I'll start and kick it back to my fellow panelists. I know that, we honed in on the people who have this heightened need and heightened risk. Well, on the flip side of that, we do see that there are individuals who don't have this recent recurring pattern, who are currently being held pretrial, that we think could potentially come back to their neighborhoods and their families with the right supports, the housing supports, the potential to give them behavioral health, mentorship, peer navigators, all of the other supports, and would not be would be successful in going back to court, moving through their criminal cases, and being in their communities. So I welcome any thoughts from my fellow panelists on that one.
Thanks, Alana. Did you want to jump in there? Okay.
I mean, I think my answer is yes, we should be releasing more people across the board. I think, and I think especially too, looking at this study specifically, like, I know that a lot of sort of statewide data has been used, but looking at New York City data right now, like, I can't stop thinking about the dangers of Rikers Island right now. Especially we've seen sort of the recent monitor coming out, which I know other folks on this panel can better speak to than I can, but the recent monitor coming out, the sort of iron curtain around transparency on the island, people dealing with real violence, death, and it not being public to families and loved ones, that this is just a very clear example of the physical, economic, and human harm of pretrial detention for so many people who mostly are just waiting for their cases to be resolved. And so when we consider how do we increase public safety, we should be considering every single possible option that does not, frankly, carry the risk of death, which for so many people at Rikers Island, it has. And so when we look specifically, I'm thinking about this group of people listed in Renee's study that even who are bail eligible, who overwhelmingly aren't rearrested, why are we not releasing those folks? So the short answer to the question is yes, we should be releasing more folks. And I think the longer answer is I think we have a real moral imperative to do that right now.
Thank you, Alana. That brings up an issue that's actually brought up in the questions and answers from the audience. So I'd like to turn it over perhaps to Ames, or if anyone else feels prepared to answer this question. Someone's asking, we have this current pending case in federal court. We have a federal monitor, and there's this consideration of receivership for New York City jails in August. How could this potentially affect the continued use of bail reform? In your perspective, it might be, a bit looking into the future. Maybe we don't know for sure, but how could it affect the continued use of bail reform and other New York criminal justice laws in the New York City DOC facilities? Or just,
Yeah,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to clarify, like how could that potentially affect the implementation of bail reform or other New York City or New York State justice reforms?
Definitely. So here I'm indebted to the work of one of my colleagues, Hernandez Stroud, who's a counsel at the Brennan Center. He's also a professor at Columbia University. Highly recommend looking up everything he's written, everything he said on receivership. He is much more the expert than me, and I will be mostly channeling him. So I think what we've seen over the past few days is, like Alana referred to, some just really horrifying developments and news out of Rikers Island that I think have increased the possibility of receivership. What that could mean for bail reform really gets back to the question of what it could mean for Rikers. There is a history of federal judges taking receivership who have fairly broad authority to enforce or impose reforms on jails. That can largely focus on like conditions of confinement, mandating types of programming, mandating basic minimum standards. I think if we got to a type of receivership that imposed something like population caps, I am not an expert on this sort of thing, but that could have some sort of effect on how other stakeholders make decisions about bail and jail. I think it's a really difficult question, and I don't want to look too far in the future, but I think you're wise to ask it. I think I would expect receivership generally to focus more on improving conditions of confinement, though, which can happen separate and apart from who enters and how long they stay.
Sorry, having a bit of a computer issue here. Thank you so much, Ames, for that. So there's other questions here about bail reform generally. Other states such as New Jersey have implemented bail reform. Are there significant improvements from other states or from other such reforms that could be relevant for New York? Okay, I can move on to another question.
Well, I'll answer.
I'm sorry.
I'll answer just quickly. I think it's important to remember that New Jersey is a very different system. I'm actually coming to you live from the great state of New Jersey. The New Jersey system is based on a risk assessment model that is designed to evaluate perceived public safety risk of people during the pretrial process. The New York inquiry is very different. The New York inquiry is about return to court. So those are that's like a baseline difference between the two systems. Something that I've thought about a lot is, one thing people worry about in systems that are focused on making release decisions based on the perceived quote dangerousness of a defendant is how do you make those decisions fairly? How do you make those decisions in an absence of racial bias? And I'm not sure anyone has really, it's a tough process. It's a tough question, and I think that's really where the inquiry should be focused.
Okay, I'm trying to, sorry, there's many questions, which I'm so appreciative. I'm trying to get through what we have here. And I'd like to I would actually like Renee, if you can, because there's many questions about the study as well. So one sec, Renee, are you there? Let me see.
I'm here, yeah, sorry about that.
So there's one very specific question, Renee, that I think is a bit technical, but They're actually, I'll ask this question. You know, they're asking a question about the contemporaneous group, right? So the individuals the individuals we looked at who were released at the same time, right? As opposed to a pre-2019 and versus a 2020 sample. In that group, and maybe give a little bit more context about who that group is, right? The contemporaneous group, just to remind us, are we potentially seeing the impact of judicial discretion?
Yes, in short, the answer is yes. So again, in the contemporaneous design, we compared people who had either bail set or were remanded in the first half of 2020. And we compared their recidivism rates to similar people who were released without bail also in 2020. So in other words, in the contemporaneous design, all judges made their release decisions in the same legal context, right? So in the pre versus post design, judges made decisions in different legal contexts, and likely before bail reform, judges were arguably more restrictive in their release decisions, simply because there was no risk of flight risk language, there was no least restrictive condition language, and there was no universal availability of pretrial supervision. So since these options were not on the table, judges might have used bail when now after bail reform, they might have used pretrial supervision now that it was available. So let's go back to the contemporaneous design. I think in a way, it shows us, you know, we know that different judges have different propensities to release. Some are stricter and some are more lenient judges. So now that in the same legal context, everybody has all these options on their table, some judges might be more, say, enthusiastic about how they embrace the spirits of bail reform, and might be, you know, and might have released more people compared to what they would have done pre-reform versus other judges who might not have changed their behavior very much. So yes, I think what we see in terms of what we see in the contemporaneous design is due to judge discretion. You know, they do make different judges make different release decisions, even if they have the same case in front of them. And at the margins, that might make a difference in terms of recidivism rates.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you for that. We're quickly closing in on the end of this webinar. There's so many rich questions. I do want to add, I think maybe we can end on a question that feels a bit more aspirational, forward-looking, like thinking about how to even discuss this issue. So one audience member says they learned a new word today, criminogenic. And while that term is appreciated, they wonder whether or not discussions within our organizations are happening to move beyond the language of criminality and towards a more holistic framework of harm and violence. And so I know that's it doesn't feel quite on the technical side that we may have started on, but any reactions to that? Like, how do we move the conversation, both generally move it forward in terms of this conversation in public safety, and what do we do about the labels and the terms we use so often and regularly, and particularly those of us who spend so much time in this space? It kind of like flows out of us like the ABCs, right? But is not intuitive to the general public. If anyone you want to respond to. I see Alana's hand went up, Aim's hand went up. Alana, can we start with you?
Yeah, thanks. Also, thank you for saying that, because now I'm like, ooh, I messed up. Thank you. And I say that particularly because we've done a lot of work on this at Forward. And can I put something in the chat? I'm not sure how to do this. But so we released a report called People First, Drop the Labels, the Harmful Labels in Criminal Justice Reporting, that sort of shows the impact of using terms like felon, inmate, all of those sorts of terms, and how they impact the way that the public perceives people who have been charged with crimes, people who are accused of crimes. And so you're right, it's really important to not use those terms and think of better terms. I also think too, now that I'm reflecting on it, the term criminogenic, which I know I used a little bit earlier, you know, there was this quote, and I am not a religious person at all, but somebody that I really liked this quote that a friend of mine who is a defense attorney was once asked when she was representing somebody who was like, you know, made the press, because you know how sometimes when somebody's, and she said something of like, you know, we're all sinners, just some, you know, some people are in the criminal justice system as sinners. And I think that's worth thinking about because there are lots of forms of harm that are defined as crimes or are crimes but aren't prosecuted, that are committed in communities that are not disproportionately impacted by the criminal legal system. And so when we talk about criminogenic, or using that word, it's almost like we're specifically focused on the types of harms that Black and Brown people are experiencing or are accused of causing, rather than all of the harms that exist sort of in the wider society and by non-Black and Brown folks. And so, you know, it almost, now that I'm thinking about it, using that term sort of legitimizes those as being the only harms worth pursuing and worth addressing. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think it is a conversation we need to have.
Ames and Deanna?
Yeah,
Ames?
thank you. Thank you so much. Gonna lower my hand. I'll figure that out. Ah, there we go. Okay, good. I think one dimension of, or one way to answer your question is that I think we need to broadly start thinking more about how we humanize this debate about bail reform and inject some more nuance into the discussion. Like we have now, as Alana's mentioned and as Renee presented, some very authoritative and very strong evidence about the effects of bail reform on crime, on rearrest rates. What I think we need more of, and what I think we need to ensure is highlighted more in the press and in conversations with policymakers, is you know, two things. Number one, the upside effects of bail reform, incarceration prevented, money saved, as Alana highlighted. But on the flip side, the negative consequences of pretrial incarceration. You know, one of the things that I've worked on at the Brennan Center is studying how acquiring a criminal record can have a significant effect on someone's earning potential and persist for a lifetime. You know, that's a stigma that hopefully will be easier to live with in the wake of the Clean Slate Act, which just passed the legislature. But jail plays no small part in that. Like jail is part of the reason that people who go through the criminal justice system might find themselves in economic hardship during and after they're being convicted of crime. So elliptical answer to your question, but I think centering the good things to come out of, or the upsides of bail reform, and centering the reasons we embarked on this policy in the first place, which are the harmful effects of pretrial incarceration, I think is a really important way to humanize this entire conversation.
Thank you. Deanna?
Yeah, I echo the thoughts of my fellow panelists and really talk about centering humans, right? Like going back to what Alana's talking about, none of us want to be judged by the worst thing we've ever did on our worst day, right? And that's essentially what we're saying. When I'm gonna hold up our lovely cue cards here, right? I hope you can see them. It's like open minds, open doors. It's the ones that we use when we're talking to people about having your neighbor be somebody who's coming back. But we talk about facts and reality, you know, the CDCs and all of the federal statistics that show you that people who are formerly incarcerated and have served their debt to society happen to be some of the most reliable tenants. They take care of the apartments better than anybody else. And all of the myths and the facts and the reality of, by the by, this is your neighbor. And guess what? Most of the people who are coming back and want to be, you know, living their lives, because that's really what it is, people who just want to live their lives, you would not know if they didn't tell you. And so anyone can have done something wrong. What we have to talk about is people who have done something that they're not so proud of are now working towards being the New Yorkers and neighbors that we all want to be. And some of us have done something that we're not so proud of and we just didn't get caught. So we just have to talk about people. And when we focus on people, then we are in a much better place than, you know, the labels of inmate or formerly incarcerated or any of the things. Focusing on the people is what's going to get us to the right place.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was a perfect close to this rich conversation. Thank you, Deanna. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Ames, for your participation. I am going to turn it over to Mike Rimpel, Director at the Data Collaborative for Justice, to close us out. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Crystal. And Crystal, you just thanked everyone, but again, Alana, Deanna, Ames, Renee, That was really a fantastic conversation. Thank you all so much for it. I have a lot that I want to summarize, but I know it's 3:30, so but it's never stopped me before. So I'm still going to take 2 minutes, but of course people can drop off if they want. I want to cover the last question, which is really interesting. I think language is important. I'll share that I've not been using defendant or offender for about the last 2-ish years in my writing. I don't know, there is a status called defendant or offender, but to me, I prefer to move away from them for reasons we've all been discussing. On the other hand, I want to share that I really like the word criminogenic, and the reason I like that word is that I think it's ironic, because what a criminogenic effect is about is the criminal legal system creating crime. And so in that sense, and because that's really what we're saying, which seems to be ironic in relation to the public conversation, I actually like that word and I like making that point. Okay, so with that said, I want to quickly check through 4 summary points, a few from the very beginning, just to reground us, and then I'm going to send everyone home. The first, I think we all understand, given Renee's presentation, research Ames went over, right? We continue to be, as we have been, at a point of lacking any convincing evidence that bail reform has led to an increase in crime or recidivism. That we understand. But I want to go back to another point from Renee's research and from Diana's original presentation, which is that all is not perfect. We have a high-risk subgroup seeing increased recidivism when they are released. And I think that point bears repeating and bears thinking about it. Now, it's only 10% of people in the research Renee discussed. It's only 8% of people in the research Diana discussed, which only elevates a point Alana made, which is that indeed most people can and should be safely released. But that doesn't mean we can ignore this high risk group. So we do need targeted intensive supports, some of which Diana began to discuss in dealing with this small subgroup in a different way. Finally, I want to actually elevate a third point that Diana also made, that it may be that truly impactful public safety solutions on a large scale are not a single thing. They're the additive effects of multiple things that people doing the everyday work of governance have to come up with and bring together. And then I want to add a final point that we've not gotten to, because we've been talking about the system. But I'm betting that everyone on this panel could probably agree that some of those most effective additive solutions are not things we do after somebody is arrested. They're things we do that prevent crime. And so I'll just elevate the one example that was discussed by Alana, and that's housing policy, when she discussed the positive effects of supportive housing. And I'm going to conclude with another example from recent research at Cornell University that I know I now cite all the time. And it found that in New York State communities with especially high eviction rates, those evictions and the transience of people that results from being evicted from their homes increases crime in those communities. So that points to an area of prevention that can increase public safety, but that requires actions and institutions outside of the justice system. So with that said, I'm truly done, except for thanking the audience once again for your questions. We are sharing the Q&A box. We're going to continue to reflect on your questions. And now I'm going to turn it over, Sarah Monahan, to you to cover whatever I neglected to say in that run through.
Thank you. Covered everything, Mike. Great summary of a great discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists for, again, a great discussion, super engaging, covered some really good points. Thank you to Renee, my colleague at DCJ, for a really clear presentation of the bail reform and recidivism study that we released a couple of months ago. So just some housekeeping. The recording will be available on the event webpage, which I will link in the chat, and I'm sure you all have access to as well. It's on the DCJ website, so the recording will be there. Should the panelists consent, the PowerPoints will be up there also. And if you have any questions relating to anything that was discussed today, you can direct your questions at the DCJ email, which I'll also include in the chat. So did I miss anything, Mike, or does anyone want to add any closing remarks? I think we're good. Okay, thank you so much for everyone for attending. And again, everything will be available on the webpage if you'd like to watch again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Everyone.
We're jumping off. Sorry. Oh, you all. That was great. You all have a good